According to the CDC, U.S. birth rates have now fallen to the lowest point in American history, fueling fears of an imminent population collapse. But when childcare costs more than rent in all 50 states, and 62% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, it raises the question, how are people expected to have kids when they're struggling to afford even the most basic necessities? While headlines frame the nation's declining birth rate as a recent phenomenon fueled by individual selfishness, the reality is that this trend has actually been building for the last 2 centuries, as economic factors fundamentally redefine the true cost of raising children. Prior to the rapid industrialization and urbanization that unfolded during the Second Industrial Revolution, an estimated 75% of the nation's labor force worked in agriculture, with the average family viewing their children as economic assets since they performed essential labor for the farm while simultaneously helping raise their younger siblings, with recent studies even suggesting that families with a mother-in-law living nearby were more likely to have additional children, as her presence allowed older siblings to contribute more directly to farm labor, where by 1835, the total fertility rate in the United States reached 7.0, one of the highest rates in the Western world. And this is further supported by the book Industrialization, Family Life, and Class Relations, which states that multiple sources of revenue and the fact that children became profitable at an early age encouraged marriage and large families both in the town and in the countryside, as industries not only sustained a large population, but also encouraged people to breed over large families in a desperate attempt to survive on the minimal earnings of several children, fundamentally providing the correlation between having children as a result of economic conditions. However, as industrialization accelerated, wealth inequality began to widen dramatically, as the collapse of the traditional STEM family and children were no longer inheriting the family farm in exchange for supporting their aging parents. Instead, wealth was divided and generational transfers of economic stability were lost, resulting in working-class families being forced into crowded urban housing in search of daily wages, where community-driven, task-oriented workdays, once limited to 4 to 6 months out of the year, were replaced by relentless, year-round factory schedules demanding 12 to 16 hours a day from people of all ages, with studies showing that as mother-in-laws were forced to move into the same household rather than just living nearby, fertility actually declined, as co-residence households often brought more conflict than relief, with economic strain, lack of space, and intergenerational tension outweighing any benefit to childbearing, where this absence of reliable childcare placed even further stress on working-class parents. As a result of agricultural skills becoming increasingly obsolete in industrial settings, men were largely unable to support their families on a single income. And unlike life on the farm, where women worked alongside their husbands for 12 to 16 hours a day, the separation between the home and the factory made it nearly impossible for mothers to earn wages while also caring for their children, leading to a rapid expansion of orphanages and kindergartens as families adapted to economic pressures they could no longer manage alone. But despite wealthier families being able to afford the rising cost of childcare, their fertility rates were also rapidly declining, where according to the study Fertility Decline in the United States, by 1930, women married to men in professional and managerial occupations had 18.3% fewer children than those married to farmers, as larger families were increasingly viewed as an economic liability, where unlike working-class households who were consistently fighting for the quality of their families' lives in hopes of increased wages and better working conditions, middle and upper-class families prioritized the long-term outcomes of their children, viewing them as financial investments, where having fewer children allowed families to afford private schools and a college education, all in hopes to position them for upward mobility and an increasingly stratified economy, signaling that the decline in fertility neither stemmed from an improved standard of living, as it is often argued, nor did it necessarily lead to a higher standard of living. Instead, fertility and mortality signified distress among certain elements of the industrial population, where this trend was further accelerated during the Great Depression, as 25% of the nation's workforce became unemployed during the worst economic crisis in human history. Birth rates dropped 26% between 1926 and 1936, with the nation's fertility rate now falling to one of the lowest in the Western world. And as an estimated 78% of Americans were living below the poverty line, families weren't just having fewer children, they were rapidly abandoning the idea of family expansion altogether, with marriage rates decreasing 22% between 1929 and 1939, where alongside this fractured family dynamic, the short-term economic return for raising children fundamentally collapsed for the working class. With youth unemployment reaching as high as 60% in many urban areas, children who might have once contributed to household income were now left competing against adults for limited job prospects, unable to alleviate their family's financial burdens, while simultaneously, the collapse of local tax revenue forced nearly 20,000 rural schools to shut down, leaving many families without any access to childcare or education, resulting in over 250,000 teenagers to run away from home in search of work, as they came to view themselves as burdens for their families. Yet in urban centers, where some public infrastructure remained intact, grade school attendance actually began to rise, as families leaned on education as a temporary refuge. But for the upper middle class families, such as doctors, lawyers, and other professionals, despite losing as much as 40% of their income, they were not only able to keep their children in school, but could also afford to send them to high school, resulting in a 20% increase in high school graduates by the end of the Great Depression. Where this growing divide in educational access didn't just widen wealth inequality, it marked for the first time in American history that adolescence had become completely defined by financial dependency rather than income contribution. Where alongside this cultural shift in the nation's perspective on having children, emerged an entirely new labor force dynamic consisting of millions of married women between the ages of 20 and 34, later identified by economists as the D cohort, who entered the workforce throughout the early 1930s to fill the labor vacuum left by unprecedented levels of male unemployment. Where unlike the cultural expectation to leave their jobs to raise children, the D cohort remained employed as childbirth was delayed, since they became essential to their family's economic survival. However, by the late 1930s, New Deal programs such as the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration provided jobs for millions of young men with federal investment in public infrastructure, resulting in the construction of over 40,000 new schools, libraries, and hospitals between 1933 and 1939. And even though the actual cost of raising children had not substantially decreased, cultural narratives around family began to shift, as the rise of American mass media introduced characters like Superman, offering the nation's youth a sense of hope that a better tomorrow was always possible, resulting in both fertility and marriage rates beginning to rise by the end of the decade, with some historians and demographers even stating that the baby boom actually began prior to the war, signaling that despite economic hardships, even a fragile sense of optimism was enough for families to begin planning for the future. But just as that optimism began to reemerge, the United States transitioned towards full-scale mobilization, where between 1938 and 1941, defense budgets more than tripled, and factories across the country reactivated idle machinery, pulling labor from some of the hardest hit regions, and once again relying heavily on the D cohort. While cultural campaigns like Rosie the Riveter predominantly targeted single women, it was the D cohort, who had already built years of work experience during the Depression, who filled the majority of clerical, service, and manufacturing roles. And as the National War Labor Board extended factory hours and froze wages through the Stabilization Act to curb inflation, as a result of the D cohort entering the labor market in states most affected by the Great Depression, they offered practically free wages, where even by the 1950s, they were earning nearly 30% less than their peers in regions that experienced less economic disruption. And while employers began offering incentives such as pension plans, health insurance, and childcare in hopes of attracting more workers, industries that once absorbed young women became overcrowded with the older, more experienced, and at entry-level wages, D cohort, which effectively locked out many young women from the job market entirely, where simultaneously, the GI Bill provided returning veterans with free college tuition, monthly stipends, and access to low-interest home loans. And with male wages rising, mortgage access expanding, profound national optimism, a restructured female labor force, and employer-sponsored benefits stabilizing household income, the economic rationale for dual-income households weakened following the war, resulting in the majority of America's youth to once again turn towards family formation. Where between 1946 and 1964, over 76 million babies were born, creating what we now call the baby boom. But despite the post-war economic boom continuing throughout the nation, by the early 1960s, the structural foundation that had supported the baby boom had already begun to erode. As the D cohort began to gradually retire from the labor force, this allowed jobs that had long been occupied to begin opening up to a new generation, resulting in American birth rates to actually peak in 1957, long before the end of the baby boom. And as the FDA approved the first oral contraceptive in 1960, for a generation coming of age amidst rising divorce rates, growing disillusionment, and a cultural rejection of traditional societal norms, the nuclear family no longer represented the singular path forward. Instead, family planning became more intentional, particularly as more young Americans began to question whether the future was going to be more prosperous than in the past. Unlike their parents who had endured the direct hardships of the Great Depression and of the war, America's youngest generations grew up in an era dominated by ideological conflict, where the looming threat of nuclear war, coupled with intense global competition, created a pervasive fear of instability. And as Cold War anxiety mounted, the 1980s saw a surge in research papers from psychologists and psychiatrists calling for intervention, warning that entire generations were growing up with a sense of helplessness, with the Department of Psychology at Harvard University stating, "This fear of nuclear annihilation fostered a sense of having no future, an anxiety that persisted into adulthood, influencing personal decisions like delaying marriage and creating a future generation." In England, the School of Humanities and Social Sciences described a similar trend, writing that the threat of nuclear war involves an overwhelming threat to the individual's future, that he or she will have no future, and that there is no point for planning for marriage, children, or a career. The National University of Columbia echoed these concerns globally, stating nuclear war is not just a problem for the first and second worlds, but has gone beyond these cultural limitations and is very relevant for young people of the third world. In reality, the possibility of nuclear holocaust is a planetary concern. It is a problem for all people, which in my opinion helps us explain why birth rates began to collapse worldwide. And according to the Department of Psychology at Illinois, there is also cynicism, sadness, bitterness, and a sense of helplessness. Children perceive that the adult generation is unable or unwilling to halt the arms race, which in many ways mirrors the hopelessness and abandonment that defines America's youth today. And for a generation already questioning whether the future was even worth planning for, the one thing that many still held on to was figures of hope, embodied by a rising wave of leaders who spoke directly to the moral, economic, and civil struggles of everyday Americans. President John F. Kennedy inspired the belief that the government could still serve the people, urging the nation to look beyond Cold War fear and towards a shared vision of progress.
I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time.
Martin Luther King Jr. gave voice to the oppressed, uniting communities under the banner of dignity, justice, and nonviolence.
Cowardice asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it politic? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right? And on some positions, it is necessary for the moral individual to take a stand that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular, but he must do it because it is right.
With Robert F. Kennedy offering a bridge between the poor, the disillusioned, and a political system that felt increasingly out of reach.
So I ask for your help in the cities and the homes of the state, into your towns and into your farms, contributing your concern and your action, warning of the danger of what we are doing, and giving forth what we can do, the promise of America. I ask for your help. I come here to this state. I come here to this great university, and I ask for your help to change the course of the United States, to give us back our spirit, give us back our heart, and give us back our soul. I ask for your help.
But within 5 years, 3 of the most unifying figures in American life were gone, and with them, much of the optimism that had defined the post-war era. And when the nation was still told to look to the moon for a sense of hope that there is always a better tomorrow, they were then met with the fundamental collapse of economic prosperity, where the neglect of systemic change has only compounded to further difficulties for each generation. Where today, despite historic levels of national debt, credit card debt, student loan debt, unaffordable housing, rapid job replacement, foreign conflict, and domestic chaos, where 62% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck and 59% can't even afford an unexpected $1,000 expense. America's youth is just once again scapegoated for every economic strain, cultural shift, institutional failure, as if personal selfishness is the sole reason people aren't having children inside of a world that is rapidly increasing the price tag of stability. What if instead of selfishness, it's because 52% of young adults between the ages of 18 and 29 are still living with their parents, as the median home price now sits above $420,000, while the average rent has climbed past $1,700 a month. Or maybe it's because 52% of recent college graduates aren't even working in a job that requires a degree, despite millennials holding over $40,000 in student loan debt and Gen Z already averaging over $30,000. Or even simply the fact that the annual cost of raising a child has now reached $29,419, up 35.7% since 2023. And it could also be the fact that we were raised being told, do not get married or start a family until you're financially secure. With MIT calculating that to support a spouse and a child, the income needed to afford basic necessities is $75,518, while the median personal income is just $48,000. And for a dual income household, that number jumps to $86,459, while the median household income in 2023 was only $80,610. And despite nominal wage growth, women who become mothers still earn 40% less over the following decade than their childless peers, a penalty that only deepens the financial strain. But maybe it's also just the fact that 51% of young Americans report feeling down, depressed, or hopeless, while in the UK, 45% said anxiety around recent political and economic events affects them daily, as we simultaneously watch our parents, after a lifetime of working, still barely scrape by. And so when society asks the question, why do young people not want to have children anymore? Framing it as if they're concerned about some sort of imminent population collapse, and not that they're just worried about not having endless consumers. The reality is, young people cannot afford to raise children. If they can, it is becoming increasingly more difficult to envision a prosperous future in which your children would be able to grow up in. How can you think about having kids when you can't even afford rent, or you're barely making ends meet as it is, working a 40-hour-a-week job? I know for myself personally, my goal, my journey is to try to uncover what has happened throughout history to get us to the point where it is today. And I do that in order to try to provide some hope. I'm not able to offer solutions at this point in my journey, but at least I try to show you this is how it happened. It's not because of your wrongdoing, or it's not because you're a failure, you're not enough. It is because the system doesn't work. And even with that, I increasingly find myself feeling hopeless and helpless at moments. And if it wasn't for just the ability to be able to do FaceTimes at lunch with these little boy and little girl that I get to have in my life, and I get to speak with them, that I then see that there is hope and there is going to be prosperity in the future because of individuals like them. And for those of you that know me or have watched the channel, you know that there's nothing that I want more than to become a father. And so I work so hard. It is 1:45 in the morning right now. I have been script writing for 2 weeks to get this as solid as I can, because I want to provide hope to people, and I want to be able to set myself up to where I can have a wife, I can have a family, and I can be a father. And God, I put so much pressure on myself. It is so freaking hard. And I never feel like I'm enough, because I don't feel like I'm going to get myself to the point where I can actually do that. And I say this because I believe the majority of young people do want to be able to have a space that they can call a home, to have stability, to find a partner, and to raise kids. And then when you were told you were being selfish for not doing so, that is so incredibly discouraging and frustrating. And I know typically I would talk longer, but to be honest, that's about all that I have to say. And I wish that there was more that I could do, but I do feel confident that that this video at least got us somewhere. So I hope that I was able to provide value to you. Thank you all so much for your support. Until next time, bye-bye.
I want us to find out the promise of the future, what we can accomplish here in the United States, what this country does stand for, and what is expected of us in the years ahead. And I also want us to know and examine where we've gone wrong. And I want all of us, young and old, to have a chance to build a better country and change the direction of the United States of America.